Alright, in this lesson I want to talk about attributes. So attributes in Houdini are really important. You're going to use attributes all the time, and basically what attributes are they're just information that describes something. Okay, so that's the basics of attributes. Um, I'll show you here in a minute where you can. There's a couple different ways of how you can view attributes, but attributes are really important in Houdini, especially when it comes to visual effects. So let's go ahead and kind of check these out. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and instead of laying down a geometry node, I'll just use my shelf tools up here. I'm going to come up and I'm going to hold Control and left click on my box. I'll just lay down a box. And you can see that it laid down a box. This did the same thing as laying down a geometry node. This is a geometry node here, and if I dive down, it laid down a box node in the geometry level. So it just takes that extra step out if you use the shelf tool. Okay, so we looked at parameters in the last lesson, and here we're going to talk about attributes. So before we kind of get to attributes, there's a couple things we need to talk about. So geometry is made up of a bunch of different data within Houdini, and not just in Houdini, in any CG package. It's kind of similar. So this different data that geometry is made out of is points, primitives, vertices, and something called detail, which we'll talk about. But points, primitives are two of the most important ones out of those four. They're all important, but those are the two that you'll work with the most. And if you come over here to your viewport, and if you go ahead and look at the top left here, you've got some buttons here, and this middle one, it's already pressed. If I left click, you can see that I have points, edges, primitives, vertices, breakpoints. So these are those different types of data that I can look at and play around with, and these are the different types of data that objects are made out of in Houdini. Okay, so points. If I'm going to go ahead over here on the right hand side, I can visualize some of these things. So if you looked at this little point icon, if I click it, it says display points. If you look in blue here, you can see the different blue points. So these are points on my object. Okay, primitives. You can see that if I highlight, they kind of turn this little yellow. Are these faces here? These are considered primitives. We have edges here. Okay, so these are the different types of data that makes up our geometry. And this is important when we talk about attributes, because these different pieces of information inside of our geometry, they have different attributes that are connected to them. Okay, so we can see that a couple different ways. If I come into my box here, and if I hover over my box, remember that little eye icon that's in our node ring that I showed you a couple videos ago. That's one way that we can look at our attributes. Okay, so if I come over here and I left click that eye icon, I get this little pop-up box. And this pop-up box tells me a lot of information. Okay, so the first bit of information here tells us our box, kind of where we can find this object. Box up is a box, and then below that we have our points, primitives, vertices, and polygon information down here. So we can see that this piece of geometry has 8 points, it has 6 primitives, 24 vertices, and it tells you kind of the center of this object and some different dimensions as well. Okay, so that's important when we need to see how many points are in an object or how many primitives. We can take a look at this. Okay, now below that is our attributes. Okay, and we can see a list of attributes here. Right now, this only has one attribute, and all objects have this default attribute. It's one point attribute, and it's this uppercase P, which stands for position. So this has a position attribute, and this is a 3 float. Okay, which means this has 3 fields. Okay, so an X, Y, Z, it has a position in X, Y, and Z. 3 float, so a float, it means a decimal number. Okay, you might see something like an int, an integer, which is a whole number, a vector. There's a couple others as well. Okay, but usually vectors, floats, and integers are going to be the main ones that you'll come across. All right, so it only has one point attribute, which is position here. Okay, so we can take a look at that. Below this, our attributes, we can enter comments here. Again, this is for organization. If you're working with somebody and they're looking at this information, maybe you want to add a comment in here explaining something about this node. And then down here you can see how much memory this is taken up when it was created and stuff like that. Okay, we'll talk about cooks and all that later on. All right, so a lot of information in this window. All right, so that's one way that we can view attributes. We can look at it this way, and this is just a quick way to view attributes, just to see what attributes are attached. If we had primitive attributes, we'd see those. If we had vert attributes, detail attributes, we'd see all those as well, and a list of those attributes. Okay, I can just click out of that. Another way that we can look at attributes is if we come up here, again we're on the build desktop, if we come to this tab that says geometry spreadsheet, okay, and if I click that, again we have our box selected. So depending on our nodes, if we had a node network going, depending on which node again that I'm selected, just like parameters, if I had a different node selected, it would show me the parameters that are attached to that node. Okay. But anyway, so this geometry spreadsheet, we have again our attributes over here, and this is I think a lot more helpful as far as seeing our attributes and the values that are associated with our attributes. Okay, so up at the top here, again we have our point attributes, so we can see those. We can click on this. This is our vertice attributes. This is our primitive attributes, and this is our detail attributes. Okay. So if I go back to point, you can see that. Remember, we only had one point attribute, which is position. So we see position X, Y, Z, and for each of those points over here on the left are those point numbers. Okay. So we got 0 through 7. That's the number of points we have, and then for each one of those points, we have our positional coordinates here. Okay. So it'll tell you from 0, 0 in the center there where these lie, where each of these points lie. Okay. I can filter attributes. So if I had a bunch I wanted to search, I can come over here and search. This drop-down menu, I can hide and show certain parameters, or I'm sorry, attributes over here. So I can do that as well. Okay. So this is really, you'll use the geometry spreadsheet all the time. We're going to use it throughout the semester because, again, especially with visual effects, attributes are really important, and attributes really drive an effect. Okay, you're controlling these attributes. You can create your own custom attributes. There are attributes that are built in. So these are all relative to what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be able to drive our effects later on. All right. Let's go ahead and I'm going to go back to my scene view really quick. And if I come down and I tab, and if I come in, I'm going to add a color. Okay, this is a color node. I'm going to go ahead and connect this color node. I'm going to go ahead and display it and select it. We'll see our color parameters up here. So I'm going to put them on points. Okay, I'm going to add a color to our point. This is going to be a point attribute. I'll just keep it consistent. And my color here, we're going to go over colors, but colors, we can click this, we can get a color picker, or we can manually input colors. So this is R, G, and B for red, green, and blue channels. So if I zero this out, just leave 1, we can see that we have our red box here. Okay. Now, if I come over here, and again, if I click on that eye icon and we look at our information here, you can see that now we have 2-point attributes. We have our position, which we had before, but now we have a color attribute, which Houdini uses the CD. We have this color point attribute now connected to our object here. Okay. If I went back up, I can also come over here, and you can see this little thumbtack here. If I click this, it'll go ahead and pin it to the screen. So if I come over here and I go ahead and display this, and if I refresh, didn't do it this time. I'll have to see why that's not working. But anyway, if I went back here to my box, I'll go ahead and close that out, and I'll go open eye again. You can see that we have just our position. I'll close this out. If I come back to color and hit that eye again, we have our color and our position. Okay. And if I come back to my geometry spreadsheet now, you can see that we have position, and now we have a color attribute attached to it. So CD, so we have R, G, and B, and our color information that's attached to that. Okay. So depending on our attributes and how many attributes we add and how many we can see them up here in our geometry spreadsheet, and we can get a good idea of the data that's attached to those attributes. All right. So again, we're going to be using attributes a lot. That's one of the kind of the core things you'll use in Houdini, again, especially with visual effects. But I wanted to show you kind of what they are and where you can find them. And over the next several videos, we'll be looking at attributes, diving a little more into those. But that's all I want to talk about attributes right now. The next few videos, we're going to talk about actually working with geometry, creating geometry, manipulating geometry, and some of the different tools that are used to manipulate geometry that'll help us later on when we want to build assets for our effects, or use these tools maybe to drive some effects. So that'll be coming up here in the next few videos.